Hello students, welcome to this class. In this class, we'll be seeing in detail about the entire method of experimentation and will briefly go over the different steps in the experimental process. Now to begin with, what is a scientific experiment? According to Parameswaran and Ravichandra, a scientific experiment tries to answer a few questions. Now what are these questions? The first question is, what happens when we disturb the existing conditions of an organism? A second question will be, what happens when the disturbing conditions are changed or manipulated in some way? And a third question that an experiment tries to ask and answer is that, can we regulate the changes in the object or the organism by regulating or manipulating the disturbing conditions? Now, many students both in psychology and in other sciences ask as to why should experiments be conducted in a lab? Because most of these phenomena do occur in natural situations, and why can't we study them as they occur in natural life? Now, the answer is that if we want to study a phenomena as it occurs in natural life, we will also have to wait for when it occurs. And this may take a long amount of time. And also a situation that occurs in a natural way has a number of confounding factors, and it becomes difficult to observe and draw conclusions very precisely. Another question that students of psychology and other lay people ask is that, how can psychology be an experimental science? Because unlike chemistry or physics, we are not dealing with inanimate objects or chemicals. We are dealing with human beings and animals, and we are dealing with changing phenomena. But the fact is that psychology tries its best to maintain its scientific and accurate nature and has developed a lot as an experimental discipline. And through as accurate experimental methods as possible, it tries to study the behavior of human beings and animals and the various factors that affect their behavior and their adjustment with the environment. Now, experiments in psychology may be of various types. Broadly, we can divide them into two types, the simple kind of experiments or the univariate experiments. Now, these univariate experiments contain only two independent variables. For instance, if we want to know what is the impact of intelligence on achievement, this would be a univariate experiment. On the other hand, multivariate experiments contain two or more than two variables, and hence they are more complex. Now we will come to what are the various steps in the experimental process, or what are the various steps in the method of experimentation. To begin with, the researcher must label the experiment. He should have some kind of title for his experiment which explains as to what he wishes to study. In addition to the title, he should also specify the time of the experiment and the location of the experiment. Now the second step in the experimental process involves a review of literature. Now this is a very important step, and many a time many experimenters neglect this step, which can have hazardous consequences. Now what is meant by a review in literature? A review of literature means that before you actually conduct an experiment, you go back and study all the relevant literature, all the studies which earlier researchers have done in the same field. For instance, if you are studying the impact of stress on performance, you will go back and see how many researchers have conducted theoretical or empirical studies on the same lines, both on stress and performance, and other aspects of stress and other aspects of performance, and all kinds of relevant literature, preferably literature that is recent or belongs to the past 10 to 15 years or so. Now, why does an experimenter need to review literature? The first objective is that only when an experimenter knows what kind of research has been conducted in the field and what kind of conclusions have been drawn, only then can he determine whether his topic is actually valid, whether he's finding out something new with the kind of experiment he's putting forward, whether he's filling any gaps that were there in the previous literature or not. A second advantage of literature review is that the experimenter no doubt is going to conduct an experiment on the same subjects on which earlier researches have been conducted, and these researches have been included in the literature review. So an experimenter will get an idea of how those experiments on the same topic that he's dealing with were conducted, what were the kind of control mechanisms involved, what was the kind of research design involved, and he can both engage in replication to some extent and also engage in improvisation to some extent, so that both his research problem and the research methodology that he is using will contribute something new to the field and will improve upon the earlier researches. Now, a third step in the process of experimentation is the formulation of the problem. Once the researcher has an idea of what kind of earlier research has been conducted in the field through a review of literature, he can find out what are the gaps in literature, or what have the earlier researchers missed out, what more is left to be found in the field. Or for instance, researchers may have put forward certain problems but not explained them in detail, and hence much more needs to be done so that people can understand their conclusions. Or it may be that certain phenomena are still unexplained, or even the researcher may wish to replicate a previous experiment to see whether the results which an earlier experimenter has found can be replicated and will also be applicable to different situations. So the problem that the researcher puts forward should be based on these facts. It should be clear, it should be concise, it should be workable. With whatever research designs and whatever instruments he has, he must be able to solve the problem. If he puts in a very complex problem, it may be very difficult actually to solve it and to produce answers within a limited time period. Once the problem is formulated, the next step for the experimenter is to define the variables. He must define what are his independent variable or variables and what are the dependent variable or variables. Independent variable, as you know, is a variable which the experimenter manipulates to see its effect on the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is the variable which changes in accordance with changes in the independent variable. Also, he should formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable proposition of the relationship between two variables, that is the independent variable and the dependent variable, or whatever variables are there in the experimental process. This hypothesis should be clear and concise, it should be organized, and it should be simple enough to be understood. The hypothesis should not be too general or it should not be too specific. It should be something which can be worked out and the questions regarding which can be answered within the course of the experimentation. Now the next step in the experimental process, once the experimenter has reviewed the literature, formulated the problem, decided on the variables and formulated the hypothesis, is to collect preliminary information from the prospective subjects as also get ready whatever apparatus he needs. Now, preliminary information or demographic information may include a number of characteristics such as age, sex, educational status, occupational status, or family information about prospective subjects. Now, there is a kind of controversy as to whether this information should be collected or not. Some experimenters emphasize that it is necessary to collect this information, whereas other researchers feel that unless this information acts as important variables in the research process, it is not necessary actually to collect all this information. Now, the second part is that the experimenter must get his apparatus ready. Wherever he needs some kind of apparatus or some kind of instruments to help him, he should actually keep that ready before the start of the experiment. Instruments used in an experimental process may be as simple as questionnaires or data sheets, or it may involve complex apparatus, especially when we are studying cognitive and other processes. For instance, a stylus maze, a Muller-Lyer illusion board, or so on. Also, when we are studying the effect of stress, say for example on individuals and their physiological processes, then there will be a number of instruments coming in. For instance, electrocardiographs, electroencephalographs, galvanic skin response instruments, as also blood pressure instruments, electrodes, and so on, so as to measure the physiological correlates of stress. So whatever apparatus is necessary must be obtained, and the experimenter must be very careful as to what kind of apparatus he needs, whether he really needs it, and whether the apparatus serves its purpose in the experimental process. Simply adding an apparatus or instrument after the other doesn't increase the objectivity of the experiment. Only when it is necessary should an apparatus be used, and it should also be seen before the experiment starts as to whether the apparatus needed within the budget of the experimenter, or whether he will have to leave out certain apparatuses and processes midway due to financial constraints, which can create a lot of problems in the kind of results obtained. Now, a next and very important step in the experimental method is the control of the extraneous variables. As we know, extraneous variables are those variables which, like independent variables, also bring about changes in the dependent variable, but these are not the changes which the experimenter wishes to study. What the experimenter wishes to do is to study only the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. He wants to isolate the effects of the independent variable and eliminate all other effects or all other possible variables that can influence the dependent variable scores in any way. Now, the experimenter may use different ways of controlling the extraneous variables. Either he may begin by identifying what are the extraneous variables in a research situation. If he can identify that at least to a satisfactory extent, he may go ahead and use techniques such as balancing or applying the constancy of conditions across the experimental groups, so that even if the extraneous variables are operating, they are same for all the groups, and hence all the groups are equivalent. Now, suppose the experimenter doesn't really have an idea of what the extraneous variables operating in an experimental situation may be. So in this case, the safest and the best option to use would be to randomly assign the participants into the different experimental groups. This is because it is theoretically and practically assumed that once subjects are randomly divided into the various experimental groups or the various control groups, all factors or all extraneous variables, whether they are subject relevant or situation relevant, tend to balance out, and more or less whatever situation exists in one experimental group is the same as what exists in the other experimental groups, and hence any kind of differentiation or change in these groups can be safely attributed to the action of the independent variable. Now, the next thing that he has to do once he knows what the independent and dependent variables are and how the hypothesis is and how he can control the extraneous variables is to actually apply the research design or the experimental design. This in fact is a detailed blueprint of how the experimenter will go about doing the experiment. And while selecting an experimental design, the experimenter has to be very careful to ensure that the kind of design he uses is applicable to the experimentation in question. Say for example, he wants to study only two manipulations of the independent variable. For instance, he wants to study only the effect of some kind of reward or no reward on learning situations. So there are only two manipulations of reward, either no reward or some reward. So here easily he can use a two randomized group design. On the other hand, if he wishes to study more than two manipulations of the independent variable, say for example, he wants to study the effect of not only providing no reward or providing some reward, but he also wants to study what will happen if we provide no reward to one group, some reward, say monetary reward to one group, and reward in the form of appreciation to a third group. What kind of changes will all these three manipulations bring about in learning? Hence, if there are three or more than three manipulations of the independent variable, of course, the researcher must go ahead and use a more than two randomized group design. In short, this means that whatever research design an experimenter applies should be suitable to the kind of research question he is trying to answer. Now, another major factor in the experimental method is the selection of subjects. As we know, unless we have subjects, the experiment cannot go forward. Now, this selection of subjects typically takes place in three phases. First, the experimenter identifies the kind of population he is trying to deal with in his research. Say the population consists of students. he will more or less try to identify what is the extent of the population or what is the number of the population. Say it is 500 students. So 500 students form his universe or population. From there, in the next stage, he will randomly select a certain sample or a certain required number of students, say 50 students. And once these 50 students are selected, he will decide how many experimental groups he wants to form. Say he wants to form only one experimental group and one control group. So randomly he will divide the 50 students into two groups, 25 in each. And once these two groups are formed, the next stage of selection happens where the experimenter may toss a coin or pick out a chit and assign one group as the control group and another group as the experimental group. So you can see the randomization process begins from selecting the sample from the population, then dividing the sample into two groups, and then assigning the groups as an experimental group or a control group. So there are several stages of randomization which increase the kind of accuracy in the experimental results that we obtain. Now we come to the actual procedure of the experiment. Now, one important factor in the experimental procedure is the establishment of rapport. And this is something that the experimenters must be very careful about, because after all, we are dealing with human subjects most of the time in a psychological experiment. Hence, it is very necessary to establish a good level of rapport and to reassure the subjects who are coming in for the experiment, because they will be coming in with their own attitudes, values, feelings and fears, and they will feel that now I'm going into a laboratory where I will be tested upon and my ideas and views will be known to everyone, and so on. So it is the responsibility of the psychologist to make the subject understand as to what the experimental procedure will be all about, to remove any kind of fears, doubts or anxieties, and to reassure him that whatever data or material which will be collected during the course of the experiment will be kept confidential, so that the subject goes into the experiment feeling very comfortable and gives out a very natural behavior, because that is what we want to test in an experimental situation. A second part of the experimental procedure consists of instructions to the subject. It is very important that the instructions given to the subjects are clear, are precise, and are understood by all the groups of subjects in the same way. So it is better that the instructions be written down and read out in a very clear and precise format without using any kind of distracting statements or any kind of comments regarding whether the experiment will be easy or difficult, or giving any kind of clues. Also, it is best to use words such as please, kindly and so on during the experiment, because one of the major responsibilities of the experimenter is to respect the subjects who volunteer in his experiment. Now, a third part of the experimental procedure would be possibly to conduct a pilot study. Now, we'll see what a pilot study is. Say, for example, that the experimental procedure is very complex and there are a lot of possibilities for errors or any kind of malinterpretations or any kind of problems in actually putting the experiment into practice. In such cases, it is always best to have a pilot experiment. A pilot experiment can be defined as a kind of dress rehearsal of the actual experiment. So the experimenter, before the actual experiment, performs the experimental situation so as to have an understanding of what kind of procedures are involved or what kind of problems may arise during the actual experimental situation, or what factors may operate as errors, and so he can actually go into the real experimental situation well prepared and with full knowledge of what to expect in the real experiment. Now, even during the experiment proper, or when the experiment is in process, the experimenter has to take a lot of precautions to ensure that the subjects are acting in a way that is suitable to the experiment, that the subjects are taking the experiment seriously, that the various instruments and apparatus are working properly, that whoever is assisting in the experiment is conducting the experiment in the way that was pre-decided, and whether all the steps in experimentation are being followed in a very systematic and unbiased manner. Now, once the experiment is over and once the data or the results or the scores or the measures are collected, now we come to the next step, that is statistical analysis. because only having the scores does not indicate anything. Unless we put in statistical analysis, we cannot give any kind of meaning to those scores and we cannot draw any kind of inferences. Now, the main factor to be remembered in applying any kind of statistical analysis is that the statistical analysis should be suitable to the kind of measures or the kind of data or the kind of scores that you have obtained from the experiment. Say, for example, that you have to use a parametric statistic, you have to fulfill a lot of conditions. For instance, the independence of the sample, the homogeneity of the variance, the fact that the variables are continuous, or the fact that the population is normally distributed, and so on. Unless these factors are not met, it would not be useful to use a parametric test. Similarly, if you want to know only the independent effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable, and the independent variable is 1 or so, we can actually use a t-test to find out mean differences. On the other hand, when we have more than one independent variable, or when we want to know both the independent as well as interaction effects of the independent variable or independent variables, then it becomes necessary to use an f-test or an ANOVA. In such cases, using a t-test would be an improper statistical analysis and improper statistical technique. Now, the next step, once you have already statistically analyzed and given some meaning to your results, is to prepare a discussion report, because others should also know what you have inferred or what you have concluded from your experiment. Now, this discussion report should clearly state as to whether the initial hypothesis that you put forward has been accepted or has been rejected. Also, it should explain the results in terms of the earlier studies, whether it is in accordance with the earlier studies or whether certain changes or new findings have been found or put forward, and so on. And the discussion should be properly formulated and properly put forward. The next step involves the generalization of the results. For any experimenter, the final aim of the result is to generalize the findings of his research to the general population. Now, this generalization depends upon two factors. One is the specificity of the population, or whether the population can be specifically determined or identified. Say, for example, you have a specifically identifiable population, say teachers, then it becomes easy to generalize results from your experiments pertaining to teachers to that population. A second criteria in generalizability is the representativeness of the sample. Only if the sample is representative of the population can you generalize the results from the sample to the population. And finally, a last step in the experimental method involves a report of the research, in which you put in a detailed report of all aspects of the experimentation as well as the conclusions that you have drawn and how these conclusions stand in light of the previous research studies and what new things the conclusions that you have drawn contribute to your field of psychology. Now, this report cannot be written in any arbitrary manner. I cannot write it in my way and you cannot write it in your way. There is a kind of system or organized way in which it has to be written, and this has been put forward in the publication manual of the American Psychological Association, and all research reports have to follow the regulations put forward in this manual. Now that we have almost come to the end of the entire method or the entire process of experimentation, there are two topics I would like to deal with in some detail, because they have a great relevance especially to any kind of experimentation in psychology. The first is the use of animal subjects. As we know, in psychological experimentations, we have made a great use of animal subjects, and the subjects of our most pioneering and greatest researchers in psychology have been animals. If you can go back and remember, you will know that Ivan Pavlov conducted his famous classical conditioning experiments on his dog. Again, we have B.F. Skinner and others conducting their operant conditioning experiments on rats and pigeons. And we know of Thorndike's cat and how she put forward the theory of trial and error in fact. And we also know Kohler's monkey Sultan and a range of chimpanzees and apes who greatly influenced and extended our understanding of the process of learning and insight. In fact, experimental psychology has to specially thank a species of rat, that is the white albino rat, because this rat contributed such a great extent to experimentation in psychology, and most of the experiments or this particular species of rats as its subjects. Now the question arises as to why do psychologists use animals in research? Do they like animals too much? No, the fact is that animals do help in research in psychology, because many of the experimental procedures or surgeries or lesions that we perform so as to understand the functioning of brain areas and other related functioning cannot be ethically performed on human beings. So it is best performed on animals. Also, animals are more easily available for experimentation as compared to human beings. Thirdly, psychology often involves studies of heredity and development, and in these cases, animals become an easier subject because they have quicker breeding rates and their lifespans and reproductive rates are also shorter as compared to human beings. Now, another concept that I want to deal with is ethical problems in research. In any kind of experimentation, you have to be sure as a psychologist that you maintain all the ethical considerations that have been put forward under the code of conduct by the APA and other such organizations. You must get an informed consent from the subject who participates in the experiment, and he must give a written consent that he is ready to participate in the experiment, knowing whatever harm or risk may be involved in the experiment. Secondly, all kind of information obtained in the experiment should be confidentially kept. They should not be revealed to any person unless it is very necessary to do so. That is, if there are other psychologists also collaborating in the research, it is fine to share the details with them. But again, the results should not be made public, and once the experimentation is over, all the test protocols and all the data should be destroyed. Also, any kind of video recordings or any kind of recordings of the experimental situation or of experimental interviews should be done only with the permission of the subject. And finally, there are certain conditions in which confidential information can be revealed. Say, for example, the experimenter finds out that the kind of responses that the subject has given in an interview or through a questionnaire or some other methods show that he has several dangerous tendencies which may be harmful to himself and others. Say, for example, he has attempted suicide a number of times which others do not know, or he has a very strong suicidal ideation, or he has a strong idea of harming others. In such cases, psychologists can actually break the principle of confidentiality, and they can go ahead and inform whoever is necessary so as to prevent any subsequent harm to the subject or those associated with him. Finally, in psychological experiments, we may often use deception. We may not reveal all the process and treatments of the experiment in advance. But when we do so, once the experiment is over, it becomes our responsibility to debrief the subjects and tell them what the experiment was all about, so that they leave the experimental situation feeling as good as when they came in. Thus, we can see in this chapter that we understood what the various steps in experimentation are, and we also understood what the concept of ethics in experimentation is. So what you take back from this lesson is that whether you go into the field of experimental psychology totally, or whether you become an experimental researcher at any stage in your psychology career, you must understand that you must balance a sense of curiosity with a sense of discipline, a sense of inquisitiveness with a sense of logic, and a sense of extreme accuracy and control. Only then can you succeed as an experimental psychologist.